we're nearing the 2-year anniversary of the U.S. murder of Qassem Soleimani. I'm curious if you could maybe speak about the legacy of Qassem Soleimani and the impacts of his loss. I mean, not just on Iran, but regionally.
Well, when the BBC reporter was speaking to me about human rights and about terrorism and about Iran's regional influence, the name Haj Qassem Soleimani actually reminds me of all the evil, all the terrorism and human rights violations that Western countries have carried out in this region, and the fact that when in 2011, the Iranians, I was in Lebanon at that time, and Iranian intelligence was saying that there were legitimate protests in Syria, but there are also infiltrations, and the Iranians and the Syrian government were saying that they're being infiltrated by extremist groups. And then the Iranian intelligence was saying from early on that Western governments and regional governments were funding these groups. And the Western media, including regional media that I was on, they would say these are conspiracy theories and this is all nonsense. But going back to Jake Sullivan and all the other evidence that you've spoken about and our mutual friends have discussed time and time again, the evidence later came out that all of what Iran said was true. Everything that Iran said was true. From the very beginning, from almost the very beginning, this was a dirty war was being initiated against the Syrian people. And you know that I traveled to Syria many times during these years. I traveled to the war fronts. I traveled to different areas. I went to universities. I was alone among students in 2013, 14, on campus, and I always felt safe among them, and wherever I went, because it was clear that they were opposed to the other side. Right. Some of them were critical of the government. Some of them were very critical. Some of them were very supportive. Some of them loved President Assad, but no one, almost as far as I saw, no one wanted the other side.
Right.
No one wanted the other side. So General Soleimani, he began basically to become involved in Syria about in 2013. And this is another interesting point. The Iranians and Hezbollah, as you know, they did not become a part of the equation in a big way until I think the summer of 2013 or
right.
late spring or early summer, if I'm not mistaken, when their military began to go in. And this was only after tens of thousands of foreign fighters had already been brought into the country from right. across Europe, from across the Arab world, and even beyond, through Turkey, through Western intelligence agencies and the Turkish intelligence agency, some through Lebanon, many also from Jordan, but the main focus was in Turkey. And I remember a former high-ranking Western intelligence officer telling me, and it's a person who you both and I know, but I don't want to mention his name unless I get his permission. If I speak to him at some
Understood.
point, I'll tell you after.
Okay.
So he told me in Beirut in 2011, because I was in Beirut from 2011 to 2012. I was there for a year on sabbatical. And he told me that what's going on in Syria is a dirty war, and it's NATO is behind this, and the Americans are. And I said, how do you know? And he said, because all the people. Well, he said if I say too much, it'll become obvious who
it is.
He said all the people who I knew in Afghanistan, in Pakistan during the 1980s are now in Istanbul.
There you go.
Those people. Yeah,
that says it all. That
was then. That was then. That was not 2000. So after all these foreign fighters came in, then Iran came in. And if it wasn't for Miss General Soleimani and Mr. Khamenei, Ayatollah Khamenei, if it wasn't for these two people, you'd have black flags over Syria and Iraq. And well before the Russians came, because the Russians were cautious back then, and they were only later convinced by General Soleimani to come in. The Iranian ambassador was telling me that the Iranian ambassador at that time in Russia, who's my colleague at the University of Tehran, he's at my faculty. He told me that the Iranians were struggling, that they were pressuring the Russians to come in, but the Russians were very cautious because they didn't know how things would turn out. And then General Soleimani ultimately went to Russia and convinced the Russians to come in, and the Russians came in a big way, and they helped turn the tide, because the Iranians halted the advance of ISIS and Al Qaeda, and they were pushing back, but it was slow and painful. And then the Russians came in, the Air Force came in and helped helped in a big way. So, but if General Soleimani was not there to support the Syrian people and to help bring in Hezbollah and the Iranians and others in 2015, after tens of thousands of foreign fighters had come in, we'd have black flags all over Syria, and Iraq would have fallen.
Not just Syria.
Because
Exactly.
Yeah, because imagine if Syria had fallen. ISIS, which came into Iraq, they would have come into Iraq with a much larger force.
Yep, exactly.
They would have taken over the country. So he basically spared the region from these black flags, from terrorism that Jake Sullivan, the current national security advisor, knew very well. Those terrorists, those extremists were on their side. A decade after 9/11. Amazing.
Incredible. Yeah.
I don't personally, and I know some people that get upset with me when I say this, I personally don't believe that the United States government at the highest level was involved in 9/11. But when you look at all the filth in US policy, foreign policy, like Jake Sullivan's statements, just like the admissions that others, Hillary Clinton's emails, you can understand why people turn to these theories.
Right.
Because because they're capable of doing almost anything.
Well, they allied with it's like you said, the filth in U.S. policy. I mean, this goes back to Afghanistan in the 1980s, which we know very well. The U.S. allied with the precursor to what ultimately became Al Qaeda in an effort to use the Mujahideen against the Soviets and
the Taliban
and the Taliban, right? And and then a decade later, you have 9/11 carried out by these people who literally would not exist as an organization had it not been for U.S. policy a decade before. And then the U.S. does it again in Syria. I mean, it was kind of a photocopy of what the U.S. did in Afghanistan, though maybe even a little bit slightly more reckless, actually, in some cases, because there was just so many more extremist groups than just like a couple. But the point is of course, the U.S. is absolutely complicit in this kind of blowback, which is what 9/11 was. It was blowback.
And the Europeans.
And the Europeans,
and NATO,
because
and their regional despotic
exactly
allies.
And it's what the U.S.
and the
does.
Israelis.
Exactly. It's what the U.S. does also. Like I would equate it with the U.S. allying with fascists in Ukraine and with neo-Nazis to, against their
neo-Nazis,
against their adversary Russia. I mean,
well, not even neo-Nazis, Nazis.
Yeah, actual Nazis. I shouldn't even say
actual
neo-Nazis.
Nazis.
It's something we
Nazis.
See happen over and over again.
Or the Contras.
Exactly, fascist. And when it comes to the issue of Qassem Suleimani, I mean, I think in many ways for the region, like people don't understand, people in the US can't understand, because I don't think there's a figure as like beloved and as revered in the US, except maybe like Beyonce or something. I don't know. Like, I can't even think of an equivalent. You know what I'm saying? Like in the US, if like the if I mean, I don't know if that's probably an insult to compare Qassem Soleimani to Beyonce, but I just mean in terms of like the amount of people who know who this person is, who revere them, who admire them. I don't think there's any political or general. I don't think there's a general in the US or a politician that the same thing could happen to, that you would have the same reaction to in America. So there.
And
so
his murder actually dealt a blow to two major myths, by the way. And I actually think that his murder hurt the Americans, although some in Iran believe that it hurt Iran. I actually believe it hurt the Americans and the Europeans and Iran's enemies, in the sense that they were saying that Iraqis hate Iran, and that General Soleimani and his people. But when he was murdered, the funeral procession began in Iraq.
Right.
And you had hundreds of thousands of people in each city that the procession went through.
Yep.
Like in Karbala, Najaf, Kazmin, these are not huge cities. Kazmin is stuck to Baghdad, but it's in, it's in the corner of Baghdad. You had enormous crowds, unbelievably huge. And then you had the anti-American protest, the Million Man March.
Yeah.
So his murder, the murder of this hero, destroyed the American narrative. And then in Iran, when he was brought here, you saw people died. They were crushed in crowds. Or in Tehran, in Engelov Square, which is very close to the university, which is right out alongside where I am, because I'm on campus, and the square is right beside me, like 20 meters away. People who I knew who were there, they thought they were going to die because of the huge. So you had millions of people just in Tehran, millions of people in the funeral procession. I don't know, maybe more than 10 or 11 million people. I think they said 11 million people. It was, and then you had the procession went to different cities. So it showed the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic of Iran to the international community. So for 4 decades, the Western media has been saying the regime is deep, hated, and we Iranians are very critical. Iran, it's sort of like if I and my friends sit together after this conversation, we will always be hammering the government. We'll be hammering the state. We'll be hammering everything. We always speak in negative terms. If we get in negative terms, if we get in a taxi, everyone will say, this is garbage. That's garbage. The president's garbage. They'll attack the leader. They'll attack everything. But the same people who you meet in taxis, who all of them were at Qassem Soleimani's funeral.
Yeah.
And the underlying fact that the Americans don't want to accept, and that the false narrative that they've been, is that the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic of Iran is very high, and the contempt for the United States is very high. And even though people in Iran are very dissatisfied because of the sanctions, because of problems, Iran has corruption, just like Western countries have corruption. When I was in Vienna, there were beggars all over the city center. There were beggars all over.
Even in Vienna, wow, yeah.
Even in Vienna. But life is difficult in Iran, and the Americans, what they're trying to do, and the Europeans, what they're trying to do, and what their allies are trying to do, is to make people suffer so much that they will rise up. And you may have protests here and there, and they will try to infiltrate the protests and push them towards violence, but they're not going to succeed in overthrowing the country. So ultimately, I don't see the Americans being capable of war without destroying their own, the Western, being the final, bullet that brings down the Western Empire. And I don't see them capable of undermining the Islamic Republic of Iran or its allies in the region. So the same thing for them to do would be to agree to a nuclear deal that is acceptable to Iran, to agree to implement the JCPOA in full and in a verifiable way.